The next image we're going to draw in the city of Milwaukee is at the other end of the spectrum relative to that design arc in terms of the times that Milwaukee's had some prominent architecture built. What we're looking at now is a work by Santiago Calatrava in Valencia, Spain, for the Center of Arts and Sciences, which he developed in 1995 and was part of his initial international acclaim. To the point where Milwaukee asked him to come to the city and develop a new museum for the city, which had been installed in what we'll draw initially over here on the left of the page, a box-like presence by Eros Saarinen in 1957 that had the collection moved in there from two earlier collections over the course of the century. But it really was time for Milwaukee to have kind of a landmark institution along the lake with its other cultural centers for the arts. So in the same language that Calatrava sort of explored, when he came and lectured to the city of Milwaukee, he talked about the presence of Wright in his work. So Frank Lloyd Wright, part of that design arc, obviously, was a major impact on the organic architecture of the structural engineer from Spain. So what we're going to do here is work from this language of this model, which is similar to what he did for the Milwaukee Art Museum, and talk about the presence of Wright from the earlier time of the classical language of most American cities based on Eurocentric Western canon, and how Wright evolved away from that. And then our third drawing following the Calatrava will be the presence of one of Wright's more interesting projects in the city of Milwaukee. So round two here, again with our sharpened up Prismacolor black pencils, we're going to initially find the horizon line in this scheme. And this because we're very close to the lake and the building's very tall relative to the lake, and our view shed around the property there, we're going to have the horizon line run basically a third or quarter of the way up the piece of paper. And now the projection down, because it's not a big box or cubic space like St. Josephat was, is going to be really a linear progression that if we take the actual top deck of the museum proper, the entry hall and the public space, it vanishes back along this line toward the horizon line to the right, but it takes a very long way to get there off the page to the right. Even the left point is hard to develop because that point too is well off the page. So at the physical entry for the building is this line here at the base of the walkway, and that's going to project back to our page off to the left. So it's a really sort of spread out low linear volume, because that's what Calatrava intended, because he's got two big existing features he wanted to tie into. And we'll draw the first, which follows the perspective line in a cubic orthographic projection, and that's the Milwaukee project that was done by Eros Saarinen earlier on in 1957. And so he links to that with the County War Memorial in 57, and Calatrava on his site brings back then, as we see just beneath the walkway here where I drew this line, that's where he's linking back to the War Memorial. So several lines here is going to be the mass collection that's added between the main prosaic Great Hall here where you start, and then make your way back to the galleries towards the north. And the other feature there is he's linking north-south in the city along Lake Michigan. And if this is the arc of the Lake Michigan, we don't actually see it when we sketch it here because it actually is a little sort of a terrace that's built off the Calatrava, which kind of supersedes actually seeing the water's edge there. But it does, we'll see the drawing, it's all sky and water once you get inside the Great Hall. So that's probably the greatest piece of art in the whole collection. So the other piece he's collecting to, if the building is, let's say, really graphically, this is Lake Michigan, this is the Calatrava site, he initially links north to the War Memorial and links back to the city and Wisconsin Avenue. And those are the two grand gestures to kind of land this building and be in a really Milwaukee icon. He stitches it into the existing fabric. And so that piece that does that comes from the city here, a walkway that projects down and lands you into the heart of the project. And that floats in reinforced concrete, and it has its bastions on an angular form that sweep into the landscape across Lincoln Memorial Drive, which is this big road out front here. So we can sort of draw the edge of that in perspective. It's also going to rush off to that left vanishing point. So things are being tied down here off the page to the left, and we'll see in a second from the top deck here coming back. A couple of things will give us the site. The rest is very organic and sort of contrarian to following the formal orthographic projection of perspective. But in this case, you'll see the pieces will fall into place here. So the next piece in our sort of sketch diagram here is the language that he was really impressed by, the idea of sailboats, the movement of ships on the sea. And so his big main 90-foot tall sort of cathedral-like space on the inside then has wings on the outside, which actually move in space through the generate motorized movement of the mechanics of it. So if you just sort of do a quick sketch of some type of bird-like wings or ship-like sails that float above that, that's what's going to anchor the site and create the interest level on the campus of MAM. So those two wings are going to split along a major spine, and that spine is going to come from the center here, right at the base where that piece from the walkway, as you come up to that deck, finds that spine, and then coming up towards the top is that middle spire, as if it's a ship's mast on an angle. And on either side of that, we have sort of an oblique view. I want to show the most of the mast from the best view here on the site off of Lincoln Memorial, is the structure to hold those wings, and the mechanics then takes the arc of the edge and floats that out into space. And the other one, because we're seeing it sort of in the same sight line, this is sort of a side view of this one. This one we're going to see more perpendicular to us. It's twin now, comes over on the other edge, and then sweeps back down before it meets that middle point. So this is the spine where, in a sense, the bird in flight flaps its wings in space. So this is a projected piece of structure with a very pinnacle type of detail at the top, which points towards the heavens and the skies above. So to accentuate this opening up to the lake, then there also is on the western side of the project then the tensile bridge-like structure, which supports then the walkway that's crossing over toward the city. So this is, if this is a gesture for the lake, this is a gesture for the city. So we'll draw in this element, and all these elements are tapered so that they maximize sort of the structural presence. So imagine an enlarged piping that comes again to like a finial point, just like the one in the museum does over here. And then from that mass, which comes down and counterbalances the structure of the projected bridge over here, there are a series of radiating tensile wires, structure that supports that in tension. And so I've got tick marks for those, so you can kind of indicate there. They're not going to be necessarily in the same type of view shed as our perspective for like box-like forms, and yet they are held in an array where there is some degree of them compressing to a point way out in space themselves, another type of vanishing aspect to them. So we're going to run from the top of the mast here, back over, and then eventually following down more and more. So you see the conversion of these towards the point as it moves across the page. And finally, the bottom one then grips the walkway the closest, right about there. We can extend those out. And since we're going to keep this as the bulk of our sketch, we don't have to do too much hard line right over here. Because typically in a sketch, you want to have a major third be the actual finished aspect of it. So you don't want to move three-dimensional ideas to the edge of the page. You want to keep them central and have the white of the page float around it. Now that 90-foot space I talked about has this, again, sort of the counter effort to this element projecting out toward the skies. This one then comes down almost in a pyramidal sense to close off the space. And it too then has a series of lines which enclose the glass space, which support that. And they're a little bit closer together, and they're all going to come down, again, sort of moving in multiple directions to enclose that space. And we'll deal with those later in terms of making it seem like an interior behind this glazing. So they're broader here and tighter there, as if they're being drawn together to a vanishing point down this way. Now, along the top of this looks like a full sail wing, but actually it's the mechanics that actually moves in the course of the day so that it closes down like a cocoon over the glass at night and protects it. When the sun's warm enough and the winds are low enough, it'll open up to allow that heat from the winter sun come in or shade in the summer sun. So these wings move up and down. They tend to move at particular times of day so the people don't want to be there for their photography. But if it's over 23 miles per hour for over 3 seconds, mechanically it must shut down because it's too much of a threat to the structure. So we'll come back to that in a second. Now we'll kind of complete the mass over here, where the top of the building comes over and drapes and skins now, and then wraps to the south with great exposure to the lawn, to other major cultural aspects that move on down the lake towards Summerfest. And in this organic nature, working from the geometry of structure and the nature of structural conditioning, these large floating structural pieces of reinforced concrete then have their formal quality in a very sort of sinuous, almost skeletal form with shades of maybe Antonio Gaudí. So again, that structure, we'll see how the glazing shows up between those a little bit when we get to our element of value on the site. Now to help set this down, this is all fluid on a nice linear plane that runs east-west and then opens up to the north-south here. There is another landscape architect that was commissioned to deal with the landscape outside of it, and they established a series of planes that didn't compete, but played with the idea of the landscape shifting and moving along as well. And so they might appear to be in pure perspective, but the land shifts along that. So it's tilting planes of space just outside the Calatrava, but it helps settle that down because what we'll do in value is we'll make sure that the sky has depth to it, and then lawn out front within this artistic piece by the landscape architect becomes an important prose piece to set this down, creates a tableau for it to rest on. So here's the lip of the structure of the museum, which floats over the entry and allows people to come in from car or school bus, as well as people walking over from downtown. So multiple modes of transportation accepted here at the front portal. And I think we have just about layered in all the information we need to now. And we can start thinking about a little bit of value to pull out and accentuate the idea of the three-dimensional quality of it on the site. So the first thing we do, we'll look for ways to establish between our white and our middle gray line work now, more of an idea of the depth of where we want the ultimate dark areas to go. And that typically on a daylight view like this will be the interiors you see behind the screen of the building. So we'll start up here by the edge where the structure comes down lineally and the glazing ends. The structure is all white, so it's hard to leave white in a lineal fashion here because we've drawn it as a plane. So what we're going to do between these dark pieces, we're going to draw on lineal black and leave some white area of paper as if that's the remaining structure. So we'll come into these pieces and just cloak the existing line with a little heavier line, leaving a white area along the way. And then as it pushes out, because the other side of the inside of interior space is also dark and has light from the north, eventually you come here and it opens up, becomes brighter. You see more traditional sky right through. So you're looking into the interior and back out to the sky itself. And there's reflections too of the sky from the south. So we don't want to be myopic and do the same type of gray all the way through. We can lighten it up here. And then when we get to the top edge, we can come back in and darken it once again. And that way you get a little bit more animation along the aspects of what's happening on that skin there. And that comes all the way down to the base. And that's the building. Now on the other side, this, and when these are fully open as they're shown now, there's a little bit of a linear progression we'll see of the bars that are part of the movement. And we don't want to draw a lot of those, but just to get the sense that once you show them here, the idea that the viewer will see a repetition even though it's not drawn the rest of the way. So we could do bars here, and then maybe just the tips of those things as they show up against the sky. There's a little texture then to the piece. Now this is southern light, and right now this photograph is taken in a winter notion, so it's low light. So what happens is the top side of this is receiving less light than the face that's perpendicular to the sun's angle. So on this part of the wings, we can come in and do a little bit of a wash to show that from here over is actually a darker part of the white structure. And the tip then receives that southern light, and so it'll be more pronounced there. So we can begin to sort of highlight the mass by moving some value around in the skin. Same is true under here. These sweeping pieces that support this wing that projects out to the southern yard then encapsulates darker window areas, fenestration between the units. And those march along on the southern elevation, looking out to the parterre to the right. And there are some points when you come onto the base, it actually is relatively orthogonal. So we'll find some more traditional window sets in the edge of a corner, and that wraps into a part that's got a tilted view. It shows glazing coming down at an angle such as this. And so we can darken in the glazing area. So even though it is naturally lit on the inside, as well as probably some electric lighting, it still is very, very dark compared to what the sun can do on the outside. So in the course of daylight sketching, your darkest darks are probably going to be actually inside the building proper. This has a little cast shadow coming from the south. This will be the brightest part here. Will wrap around to a dark as that faces west in the morning light. This orthogonal space up above casts a shadow onto the building there. This is all in full white, then it wraps around in a hemispherical turn there. And this cutout piece casts its shadow onto the entry area. The entry area is a sequence of windows that are sloped like this as well. So we can bring those down. Their effect. And then right when it gets to this break point, there are traditional entry panels here, which we'll simply detail out with some door openings and then some dark for the windows above. And that'll take us into the space as the building wraps down on that side as well. Our walkway comes up and enters the building at the second level, and from there you can move back down to the main hall or continue to other administrative spaces up there. But this part will actually cast a shadow on the white walkway. So it comes in full white. It has the underside we see that from the standing on Lincoln Memorial over here for the photograph, and the underside of structure of the canted structure that supports the walkway. In the distance is the brickwork over reinforced concrete of the Sarandon building in 1957. And so that's got a dark value, that piece, and it's got a bay system of windows and openings. They're split into two large floors. And with those, there's a pattern of breaks and openings for the various glass. We won't detail specifically. We'll just change the lighting pattern on them as if some of the windows and shades are open and closed to animate this relationship between the 1957 more pure modern movement of cubic volumes to the more organic growth and liberties that Calatrava and his engineering skills adopted for this site. Now, because we're not looking at the museum where art is actually hung proper, this is more the celebratory hall to greet and convene. The long aspect of movement here is just a little bit, we'll see in this perspective, that runs above our horizon line and comes back basically off the page, and that's going to be in shade the whole way. And we see there's a little bit of light on top of that piece. And there are some bands of glass, and then again, the sloping panels at the lower gallery level. Which brings us down to the ground plane, where we want to assess some of the value in the landscape. And so this is actually a plane that tilts down. So we'll show the pieces getting larger, but being also brought up towards this height. And on the back side of that is a row of hedges. So that can be a darker green. And so you just be a series of tilted planes in space will help create a base for the Calatrava or a plinth for it. And now this is just a lawn area up here, up to the next plane over on this side. The other part of where the cars enter, so that also could be a dark plane. And this is where we draw just sort of on the edge of the pencil to get a nice oblong connection of value onto the paper quickly. So we're really kind of drawing with our arms and less with our fingertips, just moving from the shoulder down. And then fading out to the right again, because again, our subject matter is in here, the drawing will fade out to the left and to the right. And there's a wall in the foreground, which is receiving the least amount of light because it's in the same direction as the sun, and it's tilting in two directions. So we want to make that an even darker tone. And a little to the right. Okay, we can come back up to the other side of the tensile wires that come down now, and they're going to work in a system that all end up right by the base of the grand hall. They're all going to shoot down. Again, the same spacing on the way up the structural tower, but they're all being twining back down to a centralized point. And so that's a little bit more of a suggestion today because it's very difficult to render in a short time that kind of highly detailed structural language of a Calatrava. And then to help this work a little bit, even though it's delicate with the delicacy of all the ribbon work and the structural aspects, to do too much tone adjacent to it. But this is a big area of white space, which really is a horizontal envelope with the sky above it. It's a plane. And if we don't address it, it's going to read like a wall. So this is right now a tall white wall, and we want it to go back in space. So a real simple way to achieve that is just to assume a little bit of a cloud cover that's moving across in its typical pattern where the clouds are almost always the same size, and yet they appear to be diminishing in the horizon because they're so far away. So if we start with the horizon and we move sort of in an angular pitch, because the clouds don't necessarily come perpendicular to the land. So if we tilt them and just show a line of movement of clouds miles and miles and miles away, and the next set we could assume would be much closer to us. That might be half the distance to us. And now the distance between here and here is doubled, or even more so, and tilted a bit to get to yet another set of clouds to the same scale. And then finally, maybe the largest ones up here. And that's moving across the sky behind us. And so we can come back in and do a little bit now of the actual cloud thickness or depth. That'll grow for each plate. And it'll be a large one, and this one will cover here. And so if the clouds are white, we could assume maybe in the far distance there's one last line of white. In between them is the actual darker blue. So the clouds remain lighter, and the space between the clouds is a little bit of a darker tone. So I wouldn't wash too much right by the Calatrava, but once you come over to the sky over here, then we're going to get a pattern of the sky's art moving across the space, which will help fill up the platen we're working on here, and then kind of create some language of how deep the artwork is you look out toward the horizon. carry those lines a little bit through, not to compete too much in the distance, and maybe pick up a little bit of the tone over on this end. So we're getting very close to the end now. So what we want to do is just simply come back to one of our pencils that we haven't used yet, so it's nice and detailed sharp. So we come back in and show where our ultimate blacks are going to be in the sketch and how we're going to sort of win over this great quadrilateral pavilion, the main funder for the building, the great wind-like brise soleil that covers it and is in motion every day throughout the year, unless again the wind's over 23 miles per hour. So what we want to do is look for where we talked about in the first sketch, where this line is less important because it doesn't hold space on either side of it. You can't push the pencil behind it. This line is an identical line like it, but when you push the pencil in space, it actually holds volume. So it's the outside edges of the idea of pulling 3 dimensions on a 2-dimensional piece of paper is to use your line weight effectively. So we want to have this tower really be a presence against the sky there. So in the lower aspect of it, we're going to come back in and darken up the underside. And particularly when you get to the point up top, that resolution wants to be nice and crisp and delineated. So it's really out there. And then to kind of hold that, to show the anchoring of these wires coming down and doing their tensile thing, we'll put in the little couplets for them. And maybe not every one into the same detail, but just to start them. And on the other side, they're actually a little bit longer, holding up the bridge. And that gives some sort of commitment to their purpose on the site. Maybe the ones that are a little bit lower on and closer to us, you could strengthen those up as well, so they contrast with the sky. Now, the same is true for the whole shape of the building. This is the darker edge, so we leave a lot of light, so we can highlight that against the northern part of the sky, wrapping around up top here, eventually floating up to the crossing point. Give that a stronger edge over here. Now the one that floats to the south is going to have a little bit of an underside, which comes out and floats back up against the sky and rushes down and meets the high bay space. So we'll come back at the high bay space because it's crenellated with sheets of glass, so there will be breaks in the shadow. So we can come back in and do a little bit of line work between the panels of glazing as they reflect differently along the way to kind of animate that, break up the pattern a little bit, and that gives a sense of activity within the space. Do the same for the underside where we've done some dark before. This is all under a light wash of tone from the piece up above, so that lip needs to be accentuated as it breaks over that space. And then it gets washed out at the top here by the white. But against the sky, this point has become darker and darker. Even though it's white painted concrete at that time, it's going to be dark against that edge. Because that's a very, very bright blue in tone compared to this being receiving no light and casting a shadow down below. And at the base of this walkway up here, there is a little planting. And most natural plantings are going to be a darker tone and all aspects to it, so we can run that down there as a darker dark than we've been so far. We'll come to the underside of the vegetation. It's very box-like, but the base actually casts a shadow on the ground beneath. And maybe at the edge of this wall, also a much darker line at the top of it as well, to show the break between this tone and the other tone. Maybe darker in this corner of the grass as it flares out against that white wall, and then lighter against the drive that leads up to the museum. And of course, to make this walkway really throw itself up into the air, we want to really accentuate that dark aspect there and how it floats in the museum. And then one last piece to probably give it some sense of scale, because outside of these little doors here, we don't see many stairs. We don't see regular aspects in terms of the size of the human being relative to this. So we can put them in on the walkway here, and this would be a 3-foot rail, so you see about half the body of the head height, an individual, and somebody next to them, Somebody else walking out adjacent. Go over here. And it's fairly well attended sort of year round on top of that, because some of the photographs are sensational, particularly if you're doing video work of the movement of the Brise Soleil. And then we could probably put a couple people walking over here off the south deck. This diagram out again, the head, the torso, and the feet with some tone, change them from lighter to middle gray to dark to black. So it seems like there's the animation there. I don't think you have to put them up through the glass in there. I think there's enough information with the panels and the shades of lights and darks as you make your way to the building on the base there. Maybe a little bit right here on the lip, on the top of the building against the sky. So there you have part 2 in the sketch series, welcoming students to the city of Milwaukee, kind of bracketing the classical tendencies that's inherited by that European culture for most American cities, certainly in the Midwest. And then through the modern movement to the dawn of the 21st century, the work of Calatrava sort of spans those 2 decades of a real progressive attitude toward the movement of form making and structural prowess and the engineered aspect of architecture, predicated on what he believes was a real strong influence from Frank Lloyd Wright as he lectured about the relationship of the Calatrava scheme to Wright's principles. So the third one will be actually backing back to Wright, who's in the center of this design arc, and we'll see that in sketch number 3.